So, you know how to draw in perspective. You know how to draw buildings and structures in these impressive angles. But you struggle when it comes to people and figures in perspective. Now don't even worry about it. I got you. What up YouTube? It's the boy Double M and I'm coming back at you teaching you how to draw figures in perspective.
Perspective. I hope you did your homework, because in the last video I had a wait, what? What's that? You didn't watch the last video? You must be new here. Go ahead and watch my last video on perspective if you haven't. For those that especially don't know anything about perspective, because in the last video I had a few exercises that help with understanding perspective and how to draw in these different perspective grids, from 1-point perspective to 5-point perspective. The last exercise in particular is where you had to draw 3D shapes other than a block in these perspective grids. Because think about it, just thinking to what I taught you in the last video without doing this exercise, the only thing you know how to draw in perspective with confidence is the block. That's about it. In real life, you won't get these perfect boxes, you won't get these perfect blocks. You have cylinders, you have cones, but the more you move out of the built and man-made world, the more you start to see that these shapes become more irregular. You start to see more irregular shapes that don't even have names like the ones that I just mentioned. Now, when drawing these figures and shapes of some structures and organisms, not only for perspective but overall, it especially helps to break down these irregular shapes observed into simpler shapes that are easier to understand. Yeah, drawing irregular shapes in perspective can be a tad bit harder, but let's not complicate it. At the end of the day, regular or irregular, these are 3D shapes. And yes, these 3D shapes are used to make up the figure that you are drawing. And to draw that figure in perspective, some of these shapes are going to be smaller, further away from the camera, and some of these shapes are going to be bigger, closer to us, closer to the camera, to show that depth when drawing in perspective. With that understanding and your level of knowledge on the human body, you could say you know how to draw figures in perspective, especially with the simpler poses. But it can get a little challenging when you are drawing a bit more of a complex pose. It can also get challenging when you draw the simple pose but in a complex perspective. Now imagine when you're drawing the complex pose in a complex perspective. It's just too much thinking just to draw. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it,
sweetheart.
I got you. Here's an exercise that especially comes off of the exercise of drawing random shapes in perspective. An exercise that makes it easier to draw figures in perspective, that was taught by, not exclusively, but by a master of drawing and illustration, a master of drawing in perspective, Kim Jung-gi. Now let's say you want to draw the human body in perspective. We're using these 3D shapes to construct the figure, to construct the human body. Cylinders for the limbs, blocks for the abdomen, and a sphere for their head. Now these are just shapes used to construct the figure, used to construct the human body. They're not perfect cylinders or blocks in real life. Well, you do get your exception. So like the third exercise, you are drawing these 3D shapes in these perspective grids to construct your figure. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is roughly draw the front view or the side view. Skip perspective for now. Draw the front view or the side view of the pose that you want to draw in perspective. Now put that pose in a box, and then finally use lines to divide this box into sections. This is just a small drawing that you're gonna have on the side to help you visualize this pose in perspective. Now what you want to do on the canvas that you are actually drawing your pose, draw that box that the pose is in your 3D perspective. And those lines that we use to cut the simple pose into sections, those lines now become planes in your 3D box that is in the perspective grid. Now I think you guys are getting the idea here. In that small drawing, those lines should help allocate the 3D shapes that make up the figure inside that box. So now when it comes to actually drawing the pose in that 3D box, you should use the cut planes to properly allocate the 3D shapes that make up the figure that you are drawing in perspective. In that small drawing on the side, those lines are lines that cut up the box in that 3D box in the actual drawing that you are making, those lines and your cutting planes, and they help position these 3D shapes in the 3D box that you made, that you drew in that perspective grid, helping you to draw that pose of the figure that you are drawing. Don't forget to show that depth, getting smaller, getting closer to the vanishing point. The shapes that are further away from you are smaller, and the shapes that are closest to you are bigger. You can do this when there is an art piece you are creating and you are struggling to get that perspective, or you can do this just to simply improve your perspective game. Do this drawing that same pose in multiple perspectives. You can even draw other poses in different perspectives, improve your perspective drawing skills. This tip, this exercise, it helps with drawing these shapes that make up the figure that you are drawing in perspective. But the other important thing that you also need to know is the actual 3D shape, regular or irregular, of the figure that you are drawing. When it comes to the human body, I got videos, I got tutorials that help you with drawing the human anatomy, that take you from drawing the 3D shapes that are used to draw these body parts, used to get the form of these body parts, to accurately drawing the anatomy of these body parts. You guys can have fun with that. But if you want an in-depth tutorial on how to draw the whole body's anatomy and proportions, go on down in the comments and let me know. And while you're down there, drop a like if you're enjoying the video so far. I really appreciate it, man. And if you have not, hit the subscribe button. We're trying to get to 2K. Become a part of the Double Empire. Get more videos like these. When it comes to drawing in perspective, not only figures but overall, it helps to understand which perspective grids, which perspective views you can actually use, because you can't just draw with any. There are some that have their limitations. 1 point perspective. You have that single vanishing point usually in the center of the canvas with the box or whatever you are drawing right in front of you. It can easily be seen in images like these. Now, with 1 point perspective, you have these edges of the box that recede to that vanishing point while the other edges stay perfectly horizontal. But the thing is, when that vanishing point moves off to the side of the canvas, these horizontal edges do not stay perfectly horizontal. The more this vanishing point moves to the side, you actually see how these horizontal edges of the box recede to their own vanishing point, to a second vanishing point, leading us to 2 point perspective. You can only use 1 point perspective when that vanishing point is in the center of the canvas. The more that vanishing point moves to the side, you have to use 2 point perspective. That second vanishing point may not be on the canvas, but you have to show the dimensions. You have to show the edges of the box receding to that second vanishing point. Now, in 2 point perspective, you have the edge that is closest to you being the largest and the edge that is furthest away from you being the smallest, receding to either of the vanishing points. Now, it can be seen in images like these, where the scenes become a little more complex and show a little more context than would be shown in a 1 point perspective. But 2 point perspective also has its own limitations. When you're looking directly at the object that you're drawing in 2 point perspective, that's fine. But once you start rotating the object to look either underneath or on top of this object, you start to see the vertical edges that were perfectly vertically straight now start to recede to their own vanishing point, a third vanishing point. And that's why 3 point perspective is the most accurate point perspective used for drawing things in reality, which is especially seen in scenes like these with much more context and are a bit more complex. When drawing objects and figures in perspective, they are drawn in 3 point perspective because you have all 3 dimensions attached to their own vanishing point, and they're gonna stay attached however way you rotate it or throw it. So when drawing your object or figure in perspective, you still want to keep these 3 vanishing points in mind, even when you are drawing in 1 point or 2 point perspectives, because at the end of the day, these are just different ways of perceiving, different ways of showing, illustrating your 3D object on your 2D surface. We have the box. You can easily see how it's in 3-point perspective and how the 3 dimensions converge to their own vanishing point. I can rotate this same box, keeping in mind those 3 vanishing points in a way to make it look like it's in 1-point perspective, having one of the 3 vanishing points in the center of the page, with the other 2 being infinitely off of the canvas to make the vertical and horizontal edges look horizontal and vertically straight. These are used for simple images, simple drawings, simple scenes like these. Like these images, what makes it 1-point perspective is that it is a lot easier to see one of these points and a lot harder to see the other 2 points. It's all about perspective. I can rotate the exact same box with the 3 vanishing points still in mind to make that box look like it's in 2-point perspective. Now it's a bit more obvious of the 2 vanishing points. The other one is still really off of the canvas. Like these images, you have zoomed out a bit more, which makes 2 of the 3 vanishing points a bit more obvious, and that last vanishing point still hard to see, making it 2-point perspective. It's all about perspective. With a simple image like this, it's a lot easier to see the edges recede to that single point, to that 1 point of this 1-point perspective. But when we zoom out a bit, adding more context, making the scene a bit more complex, we see other edges converge to another vanishing point that just happens to be off of the canvas. In simpler images like these, it gets harder to see the other missing vanishing point that's really off of the canvas, making these edges perfectly vertically straight. But if you really zoom in into some of them, and if you really look and focus into some of these edges, you can see that some of these edges are not perfectly vertically straight. They're converging to their own point. With a simple scene, because the other 2 vanishing points are really off of the canvas, it makes that 1-point perspective look really obvious. But the more complex a scene becomes, the more context you add to that scene, the more context you show to that scene, it becomes easier to see these edges converge to their own point. It becomes easier to see that 3-point perspective, being that it's all about perspective.
Whoa, calm down, Jamal.
Now you may be asking, what about 4-point and 5-point perspective? Like I said in the previous video, you are still showing the 3D object on your 2D surface, on your canvas. You're just playing around with how you show it. Because with 4-point perspective and 5-point perspective, this just comes with trying to squeeze in as much context as you can in that scene. And it's that squeezing in that really makes these edges curve. So at the end of the day, it's just a way of perceiving the 3D object in real life. And in real life, there are lenses that do that. Animals with lateral vision like fish have eye lenses that perceive the world in this view. That's why 5-point perspective is also known as fish eye perspective. That's the way they perceive the world. There are camera lenses and mirrors that are made to replicate this view, so it's easier to see and understand. Not completely, but understand how things are viewed in these perspectives. That's probably what vision looks like with it. But don't overthink it. Just take the time to practice drawing these shapes and drawing figures in these perspective grids. Move from drawing these figures in these blocks to not needing these blocks to draw them in perspective. And from that, you get to the point where you don't even need construction lines and nothing. Slowly but surely, it all becomes intuition. But for now, God bless, and until next time, double M out.